This is going to be a video alert for any of you that own these old Mercedes V8s or are considering purchasing one of them. You know, from 1970 in the US market to 1991, Mercedes-Benz produced a very reliable single overhead cam V8 engine. It went through a number of different evolutions, kind of like the short block Chevy, okay? I'd call this the short block Chevy of Mercedes-Benz. But when this engine was introduced in 1970, it caused quite a stir in the automotive industry because, hey, it had everything the hot rodders would want. Overhead cams, fuel injection, you know, kind of a header type of exhaust system. They had produced a lot of power for the displacement. Now, the first one was a 3.5 liter engine, and then it went from that to a 4.5 liter engine. And then in the early 80s, they produced it back into a 3.8 liter engine. And then in 1986, it came out with a 4.2. It had a 5.0, particularly in the European market. And then it finished up as a 5.6 liter V8, like you see here in this 1988 560 SEC. This was kind of the end of the era for this particular V8 engine. And a lot of people have driven these a lot of miles, but I'm going to say this is kind of a big but. It has an Achilles heel. And I know those of you who've been around these engines say, yeah, I know what you're talking about already, Kent. But I tell you, you need to be aware of this. I could tell you stories all day about some of the issues I've had, including buying a very nice 380 SL that only had 74,000 miles on it because it had this problem. Now, the problem is related to the plastic parts inside the engine. So you see, it's not so much a problem with the engine itself. I mean, the engine is almost bulletproof in terms of the metallurgy, in terms of the pistons, rings, bearings, you know, camshafts, and all that, as long as it's maintained properly. But what happens to these plastic parts? Guess what happens when they get old? Doesn't have anything to do with mileage. So if you have one of these V8s, even like this one, this car only has 102,000 miles on it. So you think, well, that kind of mileage, you shouldn't have any kind of a problem. But we're talking about age here. Look at how old this car. Do the math. 1988. It's now 2016. Okay? So the problem has to do with the heat that's generated inside the engine, as well as the age of those plastic parts. So I'm going to take you inside the shop now, and we're going to open up a 1972 4.5 liter V8 engine. You know, basically, it's the same design. You know, things have evolved in terms of the fuel injection systems and the emission controls and so on. But the problems we may encounter when we pull the valve cover or the valve covers off that 4.5 V8 may be the same problems you'd find 20 years later. Can you believe that 20 years later you'd find the very same problems? So let me take you back in the shop. I'll get the lights. It's way back in my engine room, and we'll go ahead and pull that valve cover off that 4.5 liter, and let's see what we find, okay? Here you can get a better idea of what these engines look like. Once again, this is out of a 1972 280 SE 4.5. I've loosened up the 4 bolts. There's only 4 bolts holding these valve covers on, so they're very easy to remove. You're going to have to get the plug wires out of the way, but generally you can do this inspection in a very short period of time. I would recommend you get new valve cover gaskets when you do the inspection. So let's see how this one looks. Okay. You know, one of the things that you'll find on the really early ones is not all the parts that I referred to in my Catastrophic V8 manual are made out of plastic. I'm going to show you a little bit closer here some of the things you want to look at, but they include the chain. Here's that oiler tube with the plastic clips, and then you have this upper guide rail right down here. Now right away, I'm noticing how loose this chain is. If I hold it tight like this and lift up on it, look at how much movement I got. Now there's various ways to check for chain stretch, but if you have it tight across the top of the sprocket and you can lift it up, I'm lifting it up almost 1/8 of an inch. This chain is worn out, okay? If the chain makes noise, rattling noises when you start the engine up before it quiets down, that is a sure sign indication that the chain needs replacing, unless of course your tensioner is shot, but that's another issue altogether. So let's take a hold of this oiler tube now and see how tight it is. They're supposed to be really tight on these camshaft journals. Notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 plastic parts that clip in. Oh man, look at that, it just came out. We're talking about, it's not even on there. And like I say, a couple times I've pulled valve covers off where these are loose. So you can see what happens here is that these plastic parts shrink and deteriorate, harden with age. There's little serrations right there in those clips that hold it tight into these oiler holes in these camshaft journals. So these clips are a really cheap part that can cause a huge amount of problem. The other problem is right up here with this guide rail. Now this particular guide rail on the left side gets most of the chain slap, and it's the one that tends to break. Now the early ones, like in the 3.5 and the early 4.5s, have a aluminum backing and they're not prone to breaking. So that's not something that I have to worry about on the real old engines. But here you gotta see a really good close-up example why you want to inspect inside the valve covers on your older Mercedes V8s. So from that you can see why every owner of one of these V8s from 1970 to 1991. Now, it was not in every car in 1991. It was in the W126 chassis. That's the sedan and the coupes, the SEC coupe like you see here. So every one of you should take the valve covers off if you've not done so already. If you're going to purchase one of these cars, you need to take the valve covers off. The owner doesn't want you to let you take the valve covers off, then, you know, you might want to walk. Or you can look at maintenance records to see if these plastic parts have been replaced. Simple little inexpensive plastic parts that hold those oiler tubes on. They get hard, they get brittle. The oil tube falls off those cam journals, and guess what happens? No oil is getting to those, and no oil is squirting on the cam lobes. So you'll ruin the cam lobes. If it's bad enough, it'll seize, the chain will break, the pistons will hit. And I've seen other ones where that piece of plastic on the guide rail will break and it falls into the chain, and the chain, you know, jumps timing. And I've had an engine like that where I had to pull the head off and replace all the valves because it bends the valves when that happens. So this is very important. In fact, one of the first manuals I wrote, and this is probably back almost 15 years ago, I titled this, Preventing Catastrophic V8 Engine Failure. And I'm going to stress catastrophic, okay? Because if you neglect those little plastic parts and you don't change them, the results could be catastrophic, literally ruining the engine or costing you thousands of dollars to repair it, all right? So what's happened with this 560 SEC, when I went to purchase it a couple years ago, I asked the owner about this, and sure enough, he had all the receipts, including giving me the old parts. Isn't that nice? He showed me the old plastic parts. All those top guide rails had been replaced. All the plastic oil tube clips had been replaced. So this car's already done. So I can drive it with a sense of peace of mind, you might want to call that. So if you have one of these old V8s, I recommend you do some research. If you want, my manual's available for sale on my website. I go through a lot of details about changing these plastic parts as well as changing the chain, because that's the other area that you could have a problem with. You let these engines run too long, that chain starts to stretch and wear out. And if you lose the chain, if the chain breaks, and that's happened to quite a few owners, okay, and a lot of times it's due to neglect, you know, it's frequent oil changes, that really accelerates chain wear. So if you'd like to go through this manual, and it'll show you how to change those guide rails, it'll show you how to change the chain, it'll show you how to change the clips. There's a lot of pictures and a lot of step-by-step instructions. So I just want to encourage you. I want to warn you, this is an alert. Pay attention to that V8 valve train assembly to prevent catastrophic V8 engine failure.